Hello and welcome to episode 111 of Unsung Heroes, this time featuring the Lamborghini Diablo GT1 Stradale, or as some of our more cultured members of the Discord chat would probably call it, the Lamborghini Diablo GT1 Stradale. Because if that's the way it is spelled, that must be the way you say it. If you know, you know. If you don't worry about it. But this particular installment leads quite naturally on from last week, where of course we were talking about super obscure but very important 90s GT1 vehicles, in particular the kind of unwilling collaboration between McLaren and Mercedes to develop the CLK GTR. Very interesting episode, a lot of you really enjoyed that one, and of course I'm always glad to see that. As far as this one goes, as I said, it is the Diablo GT1 Stradale. This vehicle is, as far as unsung heroes or unicorns go, something of an internet darling. It is fairly well known amongst those who are amongst us, who love these kind of cars, but at the same time I don't hear many discussions about the car. It tends to be one of those vehicles that you see on Google, it looks cool, you bring it up occasionally in conversation, but nobody really talks about what the car was intended for, how it was developed, where did it end up, that kind of thing, and of course that is the point of Unsung Heroes, so let's get into its story. Well, on the surface of things, the story is actually fairly simple. Similar, in some ways, in fact, to Mercedes. Lamborghini wanted to enter GT1 racing. Of course, they were owned by Chrysler rather than Audi at the time. That hadn't happened yet. They had the Diablo in production. It was, of course, their flagship, a very well-known car, and in some ways it kind of lent itself, you could say, toward being developed into some form of racing machine. And if you're gonna develop it, why not go for the top tier of GT1, aiming, of course, at the 24 hours of Le Mans. So that's exactly what they tried to do, but instead of fully building the car themselves, they did what a number of manufacturers and smaller brands, even bigger brands sometimes, have done in the past, and that is subcontracted elements of the car's development, in particular, to another brand. In this case, not even an Italian brand, in fact, a French one called SAT. And this particular company actually works in preparing and developing prototype cars, GT cars, and getting them ready for competition. The only component that is purely Lamborghini on this entire car is the engine. Everything else was developed specifically for this vehicle, not just carried over or modified from an existing Diablo. Now, we're going to come back to the engine and its implications for Lamborghini later on in the video, but for now it was a 6-litre V12, naturally aspirated, no surprises there, mated to a 6-speed sequential, still rear-wheel drive, again, not surprising of course, with about 660 horsepower. And as if you couldn't already tell from some of the interior shots of the car, it is of course a lot lighter than the Diablo would usually be in its production form. The quoted weights for this car tend to float somewhere between 1,000 and 1,100 kilos. So in other words, not much more than a metric ton. So the horsepower per ton in this road-going form was very good. Now, what you might assume happened to this car is fairly simple. They probably started developing it and then maybe found that it wasn't quick enough, or maybe it wasn't allowed to race for some reason. Those tend to be the typical things that we bring up in an episode of the series such as this. It has happened a lot through history. Maybe the car just wasn't quick enough, maybe they didn't want to finish the project, maybe Audi taking over caused it. Well, actually, no, it was nothing to do with Audi. It was all on Chrysler, because, good on them, they finished the car. In fact, they built 2 of these. They built this yellow one, which is technically speaking the only one that still exists in this pure form, and the second one is actually far more famous thanks to Gran Turismo, because the second car actually did see competition. It was sold and sent to Japan in 1997, where it began competing in the JGTC series, of all things. And of course, a number of non-Japanese cars came in and out of Super GT events over the years, and this was one of them, the Nomad Diablo. This first chassis number, though, was actually used and homologated in 1998. It was completely done, fully ready and allowed on the street by both the Italian Ministry of Transport and the FIA governing body. So the car was ready to go. It was literally ready to race. 2 built, ready to go. They could have built more, and doubtless they were already in some form of track testing for it as well, and doubtless it was a very capable car. Unfortunately, though, it was Chrysler who killed the project. They didn't want to invest more money in the vehicle having the needed amount of road-going cars, for instance, and to pursue a racing program at Le Mans. You would kind of think that Chrysler would have told them that before they began. But I guess that got lost in translation or lost in paperwork or red tape somewhere, because clearly they didn't get that across early enough. The car was finished, it was ready to go, and you can just imagine how much of a letdown that would be for the people involved. Not just at Lambo, but specifically for instance, SAT and the engineers involved on the car. It must have been a crushing blow, because the car doubtless had a lot of potential. It would have been amazing to see a Diablo going up against CLK GTRs and 911 GT1s and various others too, of course, in the later 90s. Now, the car is kind of an unsung hero and kind of not at the same time, because as I said earlier on, it is fairly well known on the internet. A lot of people have at least seen it before, if not looked into its story. But the reason why I think this is an unsung hero is twofold. One, there's the obvious part. It's a car that's easy to forget, it's super cool, it's, the street-going GT1 era, which is inherently cool, they all are, but in a somewhat fascinating way, and the secondary reason why it's in the series is actually because, in two ways, this was a very important car for Lamborghini as a brand. Because the first reason is that particular engine that they developed in the vehicle, when they started building it around 1996, actually played into the Diablo GT and the 6-litre VT. So it was a hugely important engine for Lamborghini. The second important thing about it is that this was arguably the last super extreme Lamborghini before Audi took over. And of course, since then, Lambos have been very different animals to what they were in the 90s and before. Plus, I think the fact that this really would have been a top-tier racing machine at the time. There was barely anything more impressive than a GT1 car in the 90s, maybe a Formula 1 car, and that was about it. But it would have been awesome to see this car compete, and never actually seeing that in full Le Mans trim on the track at SAT. It's kind of a shame that we got robbed of that. Of course, you can see some of its ability in those Japanese events, but even then it's not the same kind of circuits, not the same kind of spec. So it would have been a lot cooler, of course, if the car had been approved, and especially in its road form, to see what it would actually have been capable of, considering that yes, it does have a diffuser, for instance, kind of a long-tail design, not the usual large wing though that you'd expect, such as a 911 GT1 or a CLK GTR, so I actually wouldn't be surprised if with that relatively low aero drag setup, with the lack of a wing, the longer tail, of course around 650, 660 horsepower, this probably would have been a very quick road car, because that is, for instance, more powerful than the equivalent Porsches and Mercedes, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if this was over a 200 mile an hour car, maybe even something like 210, possibly even higher, because of course it did have downforce thanks to that diffuser, the flat floor setup, but even so, depending on the ratios of the gears and the aerodynamics, it could well have been something like a 210 mile an hour car, I believe. Overall, it's a shame that it didn't fully get its day, but at least there is still that original car, which as far as I know is still at the SAT, I guess you could say HQ in France. So it does still exist. I believe the Japanese one does as well. So it's cool that the car is still around, which is something else that you can't say about a lot of these unsung heroes, which are sometimes lost or sold into a private collection or stolen or damaged. So ultimately the Diablo GT1's story was definitely cut short, but we can still appreciate the car in conversation. And of course, if you want to show your support for the vehicle, if you are a fan of this car in particular, click the link down below, jump over to that Discord chat, and of course, vote for this car in the ongoing voting polls for Unsung Heroes as a whole. But for now, that's it for this installment. Of course, if you're new to the series, click here on screen to see all of the previous episodes. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, Nike.